Hello, my name is Lincoln Strong, and I worked with Evan Rink to come up with our top 25 sci-fi facts of the 1980s. So first what I'm going to do is just read off a list of some of the most popular sci-fi movies from the 80s, and then these will come up later in the rest of our facts. So, popular sci-fi movies from the 80s include Empire Strikes Back, Flash Gordon, Scanners, Road Warrior, Time Bandits, E.T., Escape from New York, Star Trek 2, 3, and 4, The Thing, Blade Runner, Tron, Return of the Jedi, Last Starfighter, Starman, Terminator, Back to the Future 1 and 2, Aliens, Predator, RoboCop. That's our list of our top sci-fi movies from the 80s. And so let's get into these facts. First, sci-fi really went mainstream in the 80s after the creation of the first Star Wars. And our next fact is that Star Wars A New Hope was made in 1977, but it was the movie that sparked the 1980s era of sci-fi. 80s sci-fi movies were considered poppy, confident, and fast. They included lots of space travel and futuristic technologies that seemed to be impossible, such as time travel and light speed, which was different than the other decades of sci-fi that included more realistic pieces of technology and plot events that could actually end up happening someday.
No pity.
Some early
No
80s
remorse.
sci-fi films,
No pain.
such as Blade Runner and The Terminator, portrayed the future as dark and dangerous.
To return.
In the 80s, more child-friendly sci-fi movies were created, such as E.T., Time Bandits, and Flash Gordon. Space travel was a major trend in the 80s because in the sci-fi movies from the 80s because Americans were fascinated with space travel after the space race. Another apparent trend of the 80s sci-fi is authoritarian governments versus rebels.
I won't fail
One
you.
good example of this is Star Wars.
I'm not afraid.
Most of the most successful 80s sci-fi movies don't actually take place in the 80s. A lot of them take place in the future. Some movies made in the late 1980s feel more similar to the 90s era of sci-fi than the 80s. Star Trek influenced the creation of the modern tablet. At one point, Apple tried to sue Sony for copying their tablet, but Sony used Star Trek to defend themselves, saying that if a sci-fi movie could create the tablet, anyone could. In 1989, Back to the Future 2 made the idea of video calls mainstream, which obviously we have those today. During the 1980s, the comic industry was mostly dominated by the superhero industry. There were still, however, some popular 80s sci-fi comics like Watchmen, Crisis on Infinite Earths, and Akira. One of the many forgotten sci-fi films of the 80s, Robot Jox, is considered forgotten simply because it was before its time. It wouldn't be until the 1990s and early 2000s that such giant robot mechs would be a trend. Pacific Rim, Power Rangers, and Avatar were all inspired by Robot Jox. Contrary to many sci-fi films, E.T. presented aliens as harmless and friendly. The biggest contributions to the sci-fi genre in the latter half of the 80s were The Terminator and RoboCop. James Cameron's The Terminator earned him the role of directing Aliens, which was the sequel to Alien, and Aliens became a huge success in the 80s. Star Wars Empire Strikes Back is considered one of the best sci-fi movies of all time. It made $557.8 million at the box office. Empire Strikes Back is the Star Wars film that everyone compares the others to. The Star Wars movies predicted the invention of holograms. The most notable modern hologram presentation was a deceased Michael Jackson performing at the Billboard Music Awards. E.T. actually makes an appearance in Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace, which that one wasn't created till the early 2000s. Star Wars used a lot of the same production crew as 2001: A Space Odyssey, which was a sci-fi film from the 1960s, but George Lucas really liked their production crew, so he used a lot of them to make Star Wars. And finally, fact number 25 is a hilarious fact about Star Wars. Apparently, the guy who plays Darth Vader on screen was not allowed at Star Wars cast parties because George Lucas found him annoying. And there you have it, folks. That is the list of 25 sci-fi facts of the 1980s that me